Welcome to the June 6, 2023 meeting of the City of Everett Planning Commission. Kathy, would you please take the roll?
Chair Chatters,
Here.
Commissioner Atkins,
Here.
Commissioner Zielinski,
Here.
Commissioner Yanusak,
Here.
Commissioner Ballard,
Here.
Commissioner Sullivan.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before we move forward, I just want to acknowledge something that just came up in the community. We've just been informed of the passing of Senator John McCoy. He served 17 years in the Washington State Legislature, representing the 38th Legislative District, which is the primary district here in Everett. He was one of the longest-serving Indigenous lawmakers in Washington State history. He was a Tulalip Tribes member as well as a U.S. Veteran. He worked to establish Native American Heritage Day, honoring tribal history on the day after Thanksgiving each year. He led the passage of the Native American Voting Rights Act to expand voting rights access in tribal communities, and he was instrumental in the development of Quilceda Village, which was a major infrastructure project that helped to diversify the economic base for the Tulalip tribes. So may he rest in power, and condolences to all who are mourning his passing. And Commissioner Atkins, if you wouldn't mind reading the tribal land acknowledgement in his honor, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. The state of Washington was made possible by the 7 treaty arrangements of tribal governments representing the people who have lived, worked, and built community on this state's lands since time immemorial. We honor the native elders of the treaty tribes, the Coast Salish and Interior Salish, and all native peoples, and we are grateful for the chance to shape the laws and policies governing the children and families living here on their ancestral lands. And I would love if we could get some kind of just moment of silence in honor of Senator McCoy. He was a dear mentor, a dear friend, and a very big mentor of mine. I first met him in high school, and just working at Tulalip, he's been a big influence in me and many others throughout the Tulalip community and throughout Indian country as a whole. And yeah.
Thank you, commissioners, for taking that time to reflect. Are there any other commissioners that would like to add any thoughts on Senator McCoy's passing?
Yeah, I first met Senator McCoy when I was 15, as I was his page, and it was a lot of fun. And he was very generous and very sweet, and yeah, it was a good memory.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the approval of the minutes for May 16th, 2023. Do I hear a motion?
I motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
Thank you. Kathy, would you please take the roll?
Commissioner Sullivan,
Yes.
Commissioner Ballard,
Abstain.
Commissioner Yanusak,
Yes.
Commissioner Zielinski,
Yes.
Commissioner Atkins,
Yes.
Chair Chatters.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Okay, on to commissioner reports or comments. Commissioners, is there anything that you would like to report this evening? Okay, thank you. Then I think we'll move on to staff comments.
Good evening, Commission. Thank you for joining us for a special meeting this evening, continuing largely the agenda that we weren't able to get through. There was so much to talk about 3 weeks ago that we needed another time, so thank you for taking this on a beautiful evening. 2 quick staff comments. One, we're excited to announce that we've released and published the public participation plan. We briefed the commission on parts of the plan and the content that was going into it months ago, I think. And we've been doing rounds and rounds of additions and refinements to it since then. It is in a good place. It's been shared with the council, and we're starting to bring both the document and a 1-page handout that is a guide for members of the public to how they can interact with the comprehensive plan update process. We forgot to bring it here today, but we will certainly have copies for you all 2 weeks from today at the next meeting. And folks can look to find that on the website at everettwa.gov/2044, which is the project website for the comprehensive plan update. So a notable milestone. We do expect it to be a living document that gets republished a couple of times through the life of the project as we learn more about what's working and what isn't, and adapt, as well as learning more about the pace of the project and filling out some of the details in later phases. The other update is we have a new code amendment project that we're working on as a department on the request of the 2 school districts that serve the city of Everett. The Mukilteo and Everett school districts are working on a capital improvement program for the coming years, and they have 1 school each in the short term, and then we expect quite a few more in the long term as the population of the city grows, including school-age population. So they need to remodel, rebuild, and expand 2 schools coming up soon, and need some extra height to accommodate that on the lots that they have. Right now, many of the schools, we haven't done the inventory yet, but many of them are zoned single-family with a 28-foot height limit, and that constrains what you can do with a school site while preserving important land for playing tag and other open space on the site, as well as potentially being able to build a school next to an existing school without disrupting or closing a school for that construction period. So for all those reasons, we are embarking on a code project for that, and we will bring it to this planning commission in a couple of months, I think. And you'll hear more about it then. Just wanted to let you know a new piece to our work program. We had already been working on an update to chapter 22, which is the Heights chapter, just refining what was adopted in Rethink Zoning, and that was going to be part of that overall project. Based on the timelines and the complexity of untangling all of chapter 22, we split the 2 projects, which is why this appears as a new one, although it's something that was already on our radar screen. That's it for me.
Thank you, Yorick. We now have an opportunity for public comment. To those of you joining us remotely, please mute your microphone, or if you are calling in, mute your microphone by pressing *6. At each opportunity for public comment, I'll ask if anyone would like to speak. If you are participating remotely and would like to provide comment, unmute your microphone or press *6 on your phone, and when you're done, please mute again. Do we have anyone here in person for public comment today? Kathy, do we have anyone online?
No virtual.
Okay, thank you so much.
I guess I have something if I could.
Oh,
In the nature of
absolutely.
public comment, I guess it's somewhat a follow-up from our meeting last week. I know we spent a lot of time on that, so don't necessarily want to keep drudging that up. But I had a thought. I know there was a lot of discussion. We talked about the idea of an island versus an anchor. I'm talking about with the Park District project. And something that occurred to me is, I mean, there certainly seems that there's a lot of momentum behind that project, a lot of money been spent, and it seemed like a lot of enthusiasm. Something that I think would be interesting to see is, and not to put more on on everybody's plate, but almost something. I know that they're going to be coming before the commission to ask for some, I guess, permissions to exceed the current zoning. I guess I'd be kind of curious to see, along with something like this, even just some kind of rough outline or idea about what if that area was to undergo some sort of major zoning, review and changes. If there's this idea of making it not an island but an anchor, that whole neighborhood needs to be rethunk, almost in the style of Metro Everett style project. And if that's something the city's interested in doing, I would think that maybe the council would be interested in hearing that in conjunction with this project. I guess thoughts from staff, from planning department, if that is something that is feasible, if that's something that the city, a direction the city would want to go in, and make that a new center in the city, let that really be an anchor, or if that would be something that wouldn't work. I just think that'd be some interesting input, or to have in the context of that as we're moving forward with those discussions, and to talk about the feasibility of that, which it seems to me would be the tallest buildings in Everett in the city by quite some height, would be at that location. If that's going to be the case, maybe there needs to be some discussion about making that a more encompassing the entire Delta neighborhood, rezoning the entire area. But that was just a thought.
Yeah, no, it's a good thought and an interesting one. There's a couple points. First, I should have mentioned in staff comments that the council received a similar briefing to you. If it wasn't the day after, it was the week after. From the project team, and they had a couple of questions. See, the ones that I remember were around transportation and parking and around the viability of the retail in that spot. So some of those echoed some of the comments and questions they had here. So just pointing that out, that there was a council discussion about the same, no conclusion to it, of course. In terms of the relationship of the Park District development to the surrounding neighborhood, a couple of thoughts. One is, we'll be talking about the draft growth alternatives here. You will recognize the shape of that, and it's designated special, I think, because it's under special consideration right now, along with Waterfront Place and Riverfront. So that's one place to think about how in one of the alternatives or a combination of the alternatives that development could fit within its community, and you'll see that it is different in both of the two growth alternatives. It's different than it is now, and so there is more development potential closing in around it, I guess. But there is still blocks of either single family or middle housing around it. So one is to think about these alternatives in that context. Two is centers. We need to, at some point in this process, and maybe when we bring the land use element for a couple rounds of discussion here, we need to designate local centers and countywide centers that are an organizing framework for both growth and development, as well as the transportation system, as well as grant and resources from the region and from the state and the federal government. And North Everett has come up as a candidate for a center of somewhere in that hierarchy. Metro Everett is our regional growth center, and it's going to stay the top level in that hierarchy. The next level, Everett Mall, North Everett, mainly centered around the colleges and the hospital cluster, but if it's a big enough area that could encompass, or we should think about how it relates to the Park District area as well. And a couple other areas there was a planning process a couple years ago that looked at candidates for it and identified those areas. So that center designation process. And then sub-area planning, I think there's a policy in our existing comprehensive plan that identifies neighborhoods that are appropriate for sub-area planning and includes North Everett, again, probably focused more around the colleges, which are only a couple-minute walk from the Park District, but that type of sub-area planning, I think, would benefit the North Everett area very well and be able to dive into the details that we're looking at for this development, but at a neighborhood scale. Probably not in the work program during the comprehensive plan update, but something that could be flagged for follow-up shortly thereafter. And those are the three: alternatives, centers, future sub-area planning, as ways to think about that.
Thank you for raising that issue, Commissioner Yanisek, but I'm going to tell you that's dangerous because we were here a long time before. And I've done a lot of thinking about some of the very legitimate critiques around retail space and the amount of vacant retail space that we have. And so I went looking for some information on that, and there are some recent studies. It's a matter that's being studied because of, COVID. Commissioner Zielinski brought up the impact of COVID and remote work on retail space. And so some of the newer findings are showing a discrepancy between how retail spaces located near residential areas versus retail spaces located in what were previously the city center business districts where everything, operated out of. And they're actually finding that neighborhood-centered retail is doing quite well in some cases. And so that made me, think about the Park District we just don't have a lot of evidence at this point as to, how trends are going to move because COVID is like a once in a century type thing. But I thought that was an interesting finding that might be relevant to the Park District project. Does anyone else want to speak on that and keep us here all night? No? Okay.
Chair, I'm so sorry. I could add, I did take notes at the council meeting, and since this is near top of mind, I may repeat some of the notes that I took. It wasn't just transportation, traffic, and retail. There was also a comment that it looks glorious. There was an appreciation for green roofs and mass timber, and question about whether this would be seeking LEED certification. How bikeability is incorporated, an idea for naming the cross street Delta Drive. There would be a new cross street there. Some questions about how the library might be able to secure consistent operating funding, bike parking, how the development would interact with the surrounding neighborhood. How can we give access to the neighboring wetland without disturbing it? There's a food desert there, would love grocery opportunity there. And then pretty detailed questioning about the breakdown of market rate, affordable housing, how that relates to the Housing Authority's mission, and some great complicated answers from the project team on that. So watch the videos, the May 31st council meeting at the very end for the details on it, but those are the notes I took.
Thank you. No other takers? Okay. We're ready to move on to item 4A, the Everett 2044 Growth Alternatives discussion continued. So I'll turn it over to you, Becky and York.
Thank you and good evening, Commissioners. We just ran through this really quick last time, and so we thought it was an opportunity to come back and I'll refresh the information quickly since you've seen it already, but I do want to give you another opportunity to provide some feedback to the alternatives. And do you want to pass me the computer or?
Sure. It doesn't go too far.
Okay. Here we go. So again, these are the growth geographies, and they are the urban corridor frontages. That is Broadway, Evergreen Way, Rucker, Everett Mall Way, and 19th Southeast. Then there are the next level, the frames around those urban corridors. The Metro Everett and Metro Everett frames, some properties that are adjacent to Metro Everett that may be good for expanding growth opportunities. Acknowledging the light rail station areas in this update, since we expect it to be in downtown by 2041. And we've stopped calling them east-west connectors because we've added East Marine View Drive, which really doesn't run east and west, even though it says it is it east. So the residential neighborhoods, which are all the residential neighborhoods, special areas, which we just talked about, the Waterfront Place, the Riverfront, the Baker Heights, I believe that's it, and then all of the employment areas. I believe you've seen this list, but this just names all of the streets. So on the connectors, we didn't include any connectors that were in the Metro Everett, as that's just different, handled through the Metro Everett. Here again is the categorization or typologies of the housing, the single family, the neighborhood residential, which is more of the middle housing types, the low rise, which is 3 or 4 floors, mid-rise, up to 6 or 7. I see we don't have a 5 in there somewhere. We'll fix that. We're still kind of calibrating what all of that should mean. And then, of course, the high-rise, which is probably more than 7 or 8 or more. These are what the housing types would likely be in those typologies. And again, just talking about the alternative one, which is current plans extended. And this current land use plan does have the majority of growth going along the urban corridors. And so that's shaped around parcel lines and Metro Everett as well. And that's where all of, primarily the growth capacity that we have existing is located. There's a minor increase to meet the 2035 targets, and we do that through reasonable measures, and we would propose that those reasonable measures are adding, expanding ADU regulations to allow them more often, and our incentive program, which we think would make up the difference of about 1,500 units. And then acknowledging again the future light rail. But as you see, the 21,000 units capacity doesn't meet what our current 2444 targets are. We've said this before, but we will use this as a baseline from which to study the other components of the other alternatives. Alternative 2 would increase the capacity by 17,000 homes. It would follow similar growth patterns where the concentration of housing would be along the urban corridors, although we've expanded the frame, so we've added the frame to the corridors. About 500 feet, did we say?
It's in the packet,
Yeah.
both the concept and the definition, urban corridors, 2 city blocks, or roughly 525 feet.
Yeah. And this is for conceptual only. It doesn't follow parcel lines, but it is an area that we would begin to study. And again, the light rail stations, but largely this leaves the current neighborhood residential areas alone. We do know that that's going to be an issue with the new legislation that was passed. However, it will provide us opportunity to study the impacts of concentration in this way. And that would help us reach our target, our 2044 target of 38,000 new housing units. I'm trying to advance my computer. And alternative 3, which really is the middle housing alternative. It's in a dispersed growth pattern, and it's showing all of the neighborhood residential areas, allowing the middle housing types. It does continue, though, to add the concentration of growth in Metro Everett, urban corridors, and light rail areas, just because that's where existing capacity is. And that wouldn't change. So that's really the difference between the two areas. And was there any other point to that? Then just showing what those look like side by side. So at this point, I would ask the commissioners if there was any questions, if there was any comment or feedback. Let me go back to alternative 3 related to the question that Commissioner Yanisek had. When we added East Marine View Drive, so we added that as a mid-rise. And you can see that the gap between Baker Heights and East Marine View Drive then has become smaller. And that may be an opportunity to look at what's happening there.
There was one other part in the city where our standard definition for the geographies left a very narrow strip, and that was in the rectangle. Best to just point to it. Oh, yeah, great.
There was literally one block left when you added the buffers to the other areas, and
So 2
we just
blocks from
filled it in.
Rucker, 2 blocks from Broadway. Didn't leave very much in the middle, so that one did fill in. I think the one around Park District, Baker Heights, is a little bit wider, and but things to think about either for the definition of the alternatives or for the next phase.
Question on, just for clarification, so there, in this alternative, well, on all the 2 and 3, do we overlap with real estate for jobs and for homes? So how do you reconcile that? I mean, we know that we can't use them for both. So does that make them both wrong?
No, it doesn't. Our current zoning allows that, and our current capacity is calculated in that. So, all of the high-rise for sure is in our, mixed urban and business zone. Is it business? Yes, which allows that on top. So it already, except for the industrial, of course, that's its own thing, but in those mixed use, mixed urban areas and business, it is both housing and it is commercial and jobs. And we have a limitation in our zoning code that says the bottom floor couldn't exceed more than 25% residential. So you're preserving those commercial spaces, and if I recall, it has to be mixed use in that case.
So if we're so if we have a single property and you're saying that it's commercial on the bottom and you're only counting that limited area, that it could be commercial, and then you're counting that same property with what would be remaining. So you're not counting them
For
one.
housing units, or, I mean, some
Okay.
people wouldn't, but then.
You're just not
so if
counting
you-
them twice.
No.
Okay, that makes sense. And then separate question, or a different question. Was there ever a look on the corridor for like the kind of Colby or Broadway South as a spine, as a kind of a thoroughfare and for higher density along that spine? I'm just thinking it provides a secondary kind of route. And again, it's not nearly as wide and it's not complete, but in thinking future-wise and being able to handle, especially more like bicycle and pedestrian, it kind of gives a different alternative to the high congested gas emissions on the 99 corridor.
We did add, south of 41st along Colby and between Colby and Evergreen Way, we did add a high-rise designation to that area. This is 41st.
So you're thinking Colby and Broadway more like south of,
Right here.
even south of 50th near the,
Yeah,
yeah, and they are wider, it's almost similar to the connector designation for both. We wrestled with Broadway, south of Metro Everett. It's actually being studied for potential light rail alignment, although I'm pretty confident unless there's some really nasty surprises around I-5 that's not gonna be the choice. But it is a wide right-of-way. It has some mix of uses. It is generally a quiet, low-density residential neighborhood the whole way. But there are some commercial and multifamily uses along there. It's something that we can do.
With regard to Broadway specifically, it's interesting that you brought that up, because that's not too far from my neighborhood. It's actually right next to my neighborhood, and it is actually used as an alternative highway. So during rush hour, it can become congested, which is interesting that it's not being considered necessarily. Yeah, so thank you for raising that.
And I guess one of the main reasons is with the big corridors, the Evergreen Way and the Broadway are in our existing plan. They're already designated for high-intensity uses, and they have substantial transit service and even more planned. They've got the bus rapid transit. Everett Mall Way, a little bit less on the transit side, but certainly other transportation connections to I-5, and then lots of jobs around them and the mixed use and everything. So those big corridors were kind of obvious choices, and we organized it with, changes to the frontage and changes to the block or two on either side of them. The connector was the only new concept, I guess, from the existing plan. Everything else was either taking what we already have and creating kind of a layering or a wedding cake type of a transition zone around it, or with middle housing, it's taking the whole area and adding some additional housing choices within it. The connectors was the only new in all of those smaller arterials It's just single family, 28 feet. And in one of the alternatives, we're going to study low rise, I think, in alternative 3 on that area to see what it might look like. Colby and Broadway South could meet that criteria for connector. I think that's something that we could take a look at and think about. But that's why we're trying to limit brand new ideas, I guess. There's enough new stuff in this periodic update. But the connectors was a brand new idea, and that may be appropriate for those. We have a month or two before we're hoping to get kind of a final decision on this, and the path is incorporating the specific amendment requests, so I think it'll be in some of those meetings. Is there appetite on the rest of the commission for looking at Broadway or Colby as probably connector streets along with those other ones in one of the alternatives? And you don't have to answer now. You can think about it, do some research, and come back in 2 weeks, or even all the way up until when your recommendation to the council on saying these are the alternatives.
And then one other, was there like a east-west kind of connector, probably maybe like the Claremont, kind of that neighborhood across there? It just seems like that's kind of a natural place as well, that people kind of cut through with traffic existing.
Yeah, and the main reason that we're gravitating towards these isn't necessarily because they're trafficked roadways. In fact, that can be a good thing because you have the traffic that comes out of a development is right on an arterial network, but also it's a bad thing because people don't tend to prefer to live on busy and loud streets. It was more the presence of transit and the presence of shopping and amenities and libraries and all those sorts of things that brought us there. Claremont is at 50th, I think it is, would be the cross street. And we did look at that one. It was on an earlier list. A good chunk of it, if I'm thinking of the right one, borders the golf course. And it's a pretty short arterial that on the east side, I think it maybe goes across the freeway to a small neighborhood, but otherwise just kind of disappears. And then on the west side, I can't remember exactly what it turns into. We did look at it. The Claremont shopping center and the BRT stop right there, I think, is a great example of a center and one of the string of pearls on Evergreen Way that the Evergreen Way revitalization plan anticipated. But that's another one. We heard that comment at the last Planning Commission meeting too. So we'll take a closer look at that as well.
Yeah, that particular road on the east side, that becomes a commuter pathway into Snohomish, actually, during rush hour, because it goes down through the Lowell neighborhood and it connects with Lowell Larimer Road. So yeah, I definitely see why you would have mentioned it.
Okay, we'll take a look at those, and then, yeah, at some point we'll need to decide and move into the EIS, but not yet.
Yes.
My reaction to the South Broadway, South Colby area, or those roads, is that to me, they strike me as reasonable candidates for middle housing. I don't see middle housing as just going indiscriminately throughout residential neighborhoods. I see it gravitating towards certain kinds of locations. And to me, those streets in particular would make sense for middle housing, but not necessarily anything higher density than that.
Thank you, Commissioner Zelinski. Any other commissioners want to weigh in? Commissioner Sullivan?
Yeah, I just, because it's a little bit small, a little bit of clarification around the Silver Lake. It looks like it just says middle and low, high and middle, low. It's just hard for me to tell. And you said 2 blocks off, essentially. So I'm assuming 2 blocks off of Bothelor Highway. But is that just the 2 that I'm seeing? Just right around the lake? It's kind of hard for me to see the
Yeah,
colors.
right here.
Yeah. Does that say high?
It does on the road.
Okay, so
Along the road, but then here we're down to the low rise.
Okay, so it did. Okay, it jumps down. right? Middle?
I think that's low rise.
I know, I'm like, oh, if I could zoom in.
It's a frame.
And
In
our
the-
GIS analyst is making a beautiful story map that will not only allow full zooming, but have the story along with it.
Well, I can show you, or we can look. Preview of later, there. It's, connectors are low rise, urban frame is low rise.
So I think 19th is an urban corridor.
Right.
And then the urban corridor frame would be
Oh,
the
okay.
area, 2 blocks on
High
either side
and
of
then
it.
low. Okay.
So low rise in the dispersed alternative and mid rise in the concentrated
Mm-hmm.
alternative.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
Sorry about that. We're working on going out to the community again, still with our key questions. And the fact I was at the Citizen Advisory Committee this evening and provided them with a presentation. And then you've all received this about some of our activities that are going on. And then the trifold, which has how to get involved on the back, as well as all our alternatives to take a look at. But the website, everettwa.gov/2044, is really where you'll get all of the information. And our next steps are we'll be bringing elements of the comp plan to you per the schedule. We're keep updating that schedule. And then beginning our technical analysis and environmental review. And I just wanted you to know all of the things that we're doing this month. We're still hoping that Talk to a Planner takes off. I hear it's going to, anyway. And we do have a couple of Spanish sessions that we can offer. But next Tuesday night is a in-person open house up at Everett Community College. There. That's it, I think.
Commissioner questions? Okay, we have another opportunity for public comment. Do we have anyone in person who'd like to offer public comment at this time? Kathy, do we have anyone virtually who'd like to offer public comment?
No virtual guests tonight.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to item 5A. That is the 2023 state legislative session.
Okay, so we gave a preview of the accessory dwelling unit and middle housing ordinances 2 months ago or so, although it was still before they were finalized and we were just getting used to it. There are a number of other bills we wanted to catch you up on. I will just go over these quite briefly. You have the full text of the bill in your packet, as well as the highlights of the parts that are most of interest to Everett. I would be happy to be interrupted on each bill, so I'll pause just briefly and then again at the end. So objective regulations, House Bill 1293, Everett may only apply clear and objective development regulations governing the exterior design of new development, and those regulations cannot reduce the density, height, bulk, and scale. Exception for historic districts, but otherwise this applies to, as I understand it, all development in the city. This is not just middle housing or accessory dwelling units, this is all development. So words like should, words like compatible, words like, anyways, those sorts of things we're going to have to go through our code and scrub out. And this definitely relates to the middle housing and ADU code amendments as well.
York, I would assume there's some provision in there to prevent cities from just designating the entire city a historic district.
Probably, probably. I don't know what state laws govern the designation as a historic district. I would hope I would hope that, that people didn't abuse it. That's not our intent here, at least.
Right.
In fact, I should say that we have been, at the urging of our land use planners, scrubbing subjective requirements consistently, starting with rethink zoning at least, if not before that, because they're hard to administer and they reduce predictability that's important for development. Okay, House Bill 1110, middle housing, you heard a lot about that last week from Joe Tovar. Basically allow 4 units per residential lot throughout the city, more near bus rapid transit or rail, or if there are affordable units included. There is an alternate path that can allow up to 25% of the lots in the city to be reserved for detached housing. The standards for middle housing may not be more restrictive than for detached housing. This goes beyond design requirements, but can be things like you can have a longer setback for middle housing than you did for a detached house. Off-street parking is limited to 0 within a half-mile walking distance of BRT and rail, 1 on lots smaller than 6,000 feet, and 2 on lots larger than 6,000 feet. I handed out a map showing the single-family zones in the city. That would be roughly our middle housing territory that we're going to be talking about in the next item and in this bill. Also shows where there are lots that are less than 6,000 square feet. They're clustered mostly in North Everett, but overall the majority of the lots are larger than 6,000 square feet. Any questions? We'll be coming back to this momentarily. Okay, accessory dwelling units. This is another one that we already talked through a little bit. The city must allow at least 2 accessory dwelling units on all lots that meet the minimum lot size for the principal unit. We must allow ownership segregation so that you could sell the accessory unit or the principal unit separately. We may not require owner occupancy. We may not limit roof heights below 24 feet. And we may not have standards for accessory dwelling units that are more restrictive than for principal units. I did go through the accessory dwelling unit code amendments that were recommended out of the Planning Commission and compared them to this bill in preparation for sending it to the council. And we were all good except for the design standards, of course, that we had, staff was going to take the method that it was suggested by Commissioner Zielinski, and which was take one aspect from your neighboring development or from the existing house and apply that to the ADU. That runs afoul of the objective standards. So that comes out and we're back to where we were, which was no specific design standards.
York, what does that mean, the detached housing, or must allow for detached, the minimum lot size for the principal unit, that part, what does that mean?
That's straight out of the state law. We have minimum lot sizes of 9,000 square feet for the R1 zone, maybe. That's on a later slide. We'll see if I got that right. But
So this would just mean that maybe there's probably some lots that are smaller than the minimum lot size, so those ones would be prohibited from having, or you could prohibit ADUs on those.
the city could prohibit ADUs on lots less than the minimum lot size.
Do we know how many, I mean, is that fairly common in Everett right now, do you know?
It's more common with newer development because we have unit lot subdivisions where you can meet the standards for the parcel, the large parcel as a whole, but individual lots are smaller. So I think there's probably a fair amount in recent development, but most of the legacy development had to stick to those minimum lot sizes, which had been pretty static, I think, for a long time.
And I guess what I'm wondering is, does this mean now between the ADU regulation and the middle housing regulation that every single lot within the city of Everett right now, residential lot, could have a 4-unit main building and up to and two ADUs?
That would be an outcome of the 2 bills. We're thinking hard about what's the future of accessory dwelling units in a middle housing world, and I think so far we're thinking that you don't need them anymore. If you do the middle housing right, then You wouldn't have a 4 units and then 2 units, you would just have 6 units, if you could fit it within the bulk standards and everything on the lot. But otherwise, yeah, that's generally what the law is requiring. If you take the basic path of 4 units allowed on every lot, and then you add in the ADU requirement, then yeah, that's the basic requirement. Now, you can't fit all of that with the development regulations, the bulk standards, setbacks, and height limit and lot coverage on many lots.
I guess that's kind of what I was getting at, because I imagine there's some lots, I mean, you're gonna build a little small,
Yep.
you can't, I mean,
Yep. And
so
we're-
practically speaking, you might not, you can't, but
Right.
you, technically you can, but practically you can't.
Right, so we cannot blanket prohibit a fourplex on any lot.
But there's some lots that probably you could, but if they applied for it, the answer would be
You
no.
couldn't fit it, yeah, right, right. Which could be used, as far as I can see, it could be used as a loophole. I don't see anything in the bill that prohibits excessive setbacks as long as and excessively low height limits and excessively low lot coverage. It would have to apply to detached housing as well. So if a city did want to shut down all development in the city, you could have a 1-foot height limit, I think, under this bill. That's not the direction that staff is going to recommend in this case. And it wouldn't be consistent with our growth targets either. With all of this, we are still subject to the requirement to demonstrate capacity and plans for the 39,000 housing units, one way or the other.
But this doesn't compel the city to adjust setbacks to force lots to be able to accommodate
Right.
this if they otherwise, you can have uniform setbacks across the city. We're not forced to amend those to make it possible for every lot to support
Correct.
this.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, so this coming to the council soon. In fact, we're starting to put it up on the preliminary planning calendar for the council, hopefully in July. We'll start that, maybe even the end of June. Parking, this was another slide on here. This is the same as it was for middle housing. The maps that you see up there are a GIS estimate of a half-mile walking distance. You can see what that looks like with a standard block pattern, and then the more disconnected street pattern in South Everett. So in the green area, we may not require parking pretty much at all for residential development. Next is climate change. Adds a new Growth Management Act goal around climate mitigation and adaptation and environmental justice, and revises a few other goals. I believe that takes effect immediately, and we need to plan to those goals, revised and new goals, in this periodic update cycle. Some attention to environmental justice and avoiding disparate exposure to pollution, and also seeking that the benefits of decarbonization are at least equal, if not more common to historically disadvantaged communities. On the transportation side, we need to address level of service standards, which is the standard typically in the past it had been an arterial intersection delay, and you adopted a level of service standard of D, which is at a peak period, no more than 50 seconds of delay or something like that at an intersection. And if any development would create traffic that would exceed that, you had to deny the development through concurrency. That whole thing started in 1997 and has gradually gotten to be less of an important planning and transportation planning concept. But either way, now those level of service standards have to be multimodal, and so not just looking at the arterial intersection delay for a vehicle, but thinking about it holistically with bicycles, walking, and transit. Same thing for the rest of the transportation planning, just making sure that all parts of that are looking at the entire transportation system. And then a requirement for a new climate change and resiliency element. That's not due until 2029. We already have a climate change and sustainability element in our comprehensive plan, and as well as a climate action plan that I think already implements many of the requirements of this bill years early. But to the extent it doesn't, we have some time to fold that in. Lots of state agency support, model elements, technical guidance from Commerce and whatnot. Questions there? On 12-unit condo liability, any building with 12 or fewer units, this has to do with construction defect disputes and condos, and I still barely understand this one, but I think it is good for supporting small-scale ownership opportunities in housing. It loosens some of the liability for those smaller residential buildings.
So this would probably most likely apply to like a new project as opposed to something like a
I think,
conversion
yes.
or.
Yeah. There was a fix for the condo liability problem several years ago from the legislature. And this, I think, interacts with that fix to, I barely know. I think it's a good thing, though. Categorical exemptions. Many projects, development projects, are subject to the State Environmental Policy Act and have to go through a process of filling out an environmental checklist and a threshold determination and potential mitigation requirements. It adds some time and uncertainty to the process. This is another one that it seems to have, they've expanded the exemptions over time, and more of the environmental impacts have been mitigated directly by regulations and other programs rather than needing an individual review for each project. This seems to really cap that trend of de-emphasizing SEPA, or State Environmental Policy Act, in housing development by exempting virtually all housing development from SEPA review. To the extent that the development is consistent with the comprehensive plan, and to the extent that the comprehensive plan underwent rigorous environmental review. So this puts a little bit more pressure on our environmental impact statement and our environmental review process with the comprehensive plan update. But assuming we do that satisfactorily and a subsequent development that's consistent with the comprehensive plan can skip that step. And then permit processing. This was a heck of a session. These are all very impactful bills. Permit review timelines. There have been permit review timelines in state law. They never came with any consequence for not meeting them. So they were, I guess the attention paid to them was spotty throughout the state. New permit review timelines, you see on the screen there, 28 days for determination of completeness, and then 65 days for final decision for basic projects. And now there's a consequence. Permit fees would be refunded if those timelines are not met. And there's also requirements for pretty robust performance measurement and reporting. How many permits are we getting applications for? How many are we approving? What are the timelines for all of them? So we're going to have a lot of work in our land use team. This is consistent with where we have been trying to get to. We want fast and accurate and consistent reviews as much as anyone. This is going to take a little energy away from actually doing the reviews to work on the system, but I think in the end it'll probably be a good thing. And those were the bills. Any questions going back to any of those?
Just a quick question on the permit process. It says state agency support. What does that mean?
Many of these bills have requirements for the Department of Commerce or other state agencies to provide technical assistance, things like model code, model climate element. In this case, it's, I think, a pretty well-funded program through the Department of Commerce to support cities in their efforts to streamline permitting.
Like literal infrastructure, like the system that you might use, or the templates, like the nitty-gritty?
There was, for digitizing your permit process, there was going to be consultant support to do that, direct support, and then also best practices and summary reports and things like that.
Is that a barrier that Everett currently, like a challenge that they are currently dealing with, or?
We are digitizing already. I'd say we're 3/4 of the way there. Many of our permits are handled 100% online. The big ones, the building permit review that come in the giant rolled things, we're still doing in paper in many cases, but we've got most of the hardware and most of the software in place. And I think we're within a year of being 100% digital.
Additional questions, commissioners? Okay, we have an opportunity for public comment. Do we have anyone in person who would like to offer public comment? Do we have anyone virtually, Kathy? Okay, thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to item 5B, and that is 2044 middle housing.
Okay. So this was going to be the next part of what came after Joe Tovar's presentation and summary from the state level. I showed this slide, I think, last time. We're at a convergence of attention on middle housing. We accepted and are about at the end of the middle housing grant work program funded by the Department of Commerce that has 4 deliverables that I'll touch on in a moment. We also have one of the growth alternatives is focused on middle housing, that 3rd dispersed growth alternative. And then we have the new edition of the middle housing bill that is adding some new state requirements for what we were headed towards anyways, although maybe not quite as expansive as what is required now under that bill. Joe Tovar last 3 weeks ago went through the state requirements. Becky just went over the EIS alternative, and what we're going to talk about today, is the draft regulations. The grant work program had 4 deliverables. 2 we've turned in already, and the last 2 are due very soon. So actually, we wanted to have this meeting with you before turning in those deliverables so we could get your input onto them. But what they are is a gap analysis of what policies in the comprehensive plan and what regulations in our development regulations are obstacles to building middle housing. The obvious one is we have a residential use matrix that says no middle housing in this zone. But then there are some other ones around design standards and things that are obstacles to middle housing, although not a complete barrier. What changed the game is the new middle housing bill that takes square aim at some of those where we may not have necessarily had to look at that otherwise. The one on the bottom is what we hope to get a little bit of input on you, and that is a mock staff report with comprehensive plan amendments and development regulation ordinance sections. So if we were to allow middle housing, and the grant work program was only for a minimum of 30% of your single family lots you had to authorize middle housing on. This was before, seems so quaint now after House Bill 1110. But that's what this deliverable for this grant work program needs to get to. But as I mentioned, this is part of a 3-legged stool, and so we want to do double or triple duty with this. So I'm going to go through a list of development regulations and how they apply to middle housing currently. You will see under proposed for all of these, we'll show existing, and then proposed is blank. And that's what we need to type in as a placeholder in the next 2 weeks, 1 week, tomorrow. Pretty soon. We have some drafts already, but we wanted to run them by you first. And what that is going to be a deliverable to Commerce, so that does not commit us to any path. But we want it to be a reasonable starting point for the conversation, and then that's also seems reasonable that it forms the basis for the alternative that we study in the environmental impact statement. So just right on point with Commissioner Yanisak's comments about what the development regulations could be. Yes, we have to allow 4 units per lot throughout the city, but that could occur with any height limit, any setbacks, any lot coverage, any parking requirement, any parking requirement and all that. So we want to get a reasonable starting point, and we'll use that to have the conversation over the next year. And then by the end of 2024, we're going to need to actually decide on what becomes law.
So before we get into that, can I just clarify then? So we're talking about, so we know with House Bill 1110, we have to provide for the middle housing. So this is just what regulations will govern, how that's going to be implemented then?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And whatever you implement for middle housing has to also apply to single family.
Right.
Is that- Yes.
Yes.
So,
As far as design standards
or
only?
either
Everything.
eliminate it for everything, or it has to apply equally to single family.
If that seems confusing. I mean, I guess in some ways they're
It might
entirely different animals, it seems to me, possibly. So how can you have one?
So for example, and we'll get into this, we have a front porch and entrance requirement for attached housing in single-family zones. If you build a duplex, you must have an entrance facing the street. If you build a house, it might even be the same size and everything, then the entrance can be in the back. You do what you want if you're building a house, but if you're doing a duplex, we have all kinds of special standards for you. That is what we cannot have going forward. So we'll have a choice. We can require both houses and middle housing to have an entrance facing the street, or we can require neither of them. And that, I believe, is totally within our discretion.
I guess what I mentioned before, things like setbacks and height limits could certainly favor. I mean, you could call it, it's going to apply to both, but you could structure those probably in a way that would essentially make it difficult, if not impossible, for there to be a multi-unit
Could.
on a lot of. I mean, I can't see exactly what that would look like, but I mean, so
You
I guess
could,
it's
I think, although, let's get into it, and
Yeah, okay.
we'll see some specific examples. Before we launch into this, our general premise coming into this, if you read the middle housing bill, there's a list of different types, and the city must authorize 6 of the 9 types, and it's duplex, triplex, quadplex, stacked flats, courtyard apartments, cottage housing, I think. In theory, you could have a use matrix that says you can build a 4-plex and a triplex, but you cannot build 4 townhouses next to each other if that's like a different thing than a 4-plex. The way that we're approaching this and recommending, at least initially, subject to feedback, is that we have an envelope, so setback, height, lot coverage, that sets your outside parameters that you can build in, and then whatever you want to do in there, let the market decide. If you can fit one very large house on it, do it. If you want to make that 4 townhouses in the exact same space, you can do it. If it's a 4-plex, which I think the difference would be 2 over and 2 above, you can do that, but that we weren't otherwise going to regulate the types, just the bulk, basic bulk regulations. That's our framework that kind of underpins a lot of this. Just wanted to get that out first. So the first step is land use designation and zones. We currently have single family, all of the yellow on the map there. And as you saw from the alternatives, alternative 3 would change all of that to neighborhood residential. The comprehensive plan is general designations, and then you have more specific zones. Right now, single family is implemented by those 4 zones, RS through R2A. Should we consolidate the 4 zones into fewer? I will show, these are the most impactful bulk regulations. I did not get the 9,000 right. Not even close. I knew there was a 9,000 in there. As you can see, with all 4 of these zones, they have the same height limit, the same front setback, the same rear setback, the same side setback, almost the same lot coverage. Really, it's the minimum lot area that differentiates these, and that minimum lot area is tied to a maximum density. So if I wanted to build a duplex in the R2 zone, it's a slightly different minimum number of square feet that you must have. But otherwise, if you take away the point of the minimum lot area is to constrain the number of units that you can build, which is now not permissible under this bill, then you're left with all the columns above that, which are pretty similar. So one question is, does it make sense to have 4 different zones, or could we consolidate that a little bit? We also will need to decide, is there differentiation in those zones throughout the city, and in what way? So is a lower maximum lot coverage in a lower intensity zone the way to accomplish that? We do not have a difference in height among those 4 zones, but you could. There's also a path to excluding certain areas from middle housing up to 25%. In the alternative, we're proposing studying middle housing everywhere, but that doesn't mean that that's where we need to wind up in the preferred alternative.
Can I ask a quick question about the exclusion of the 25%? How does that interact with the regulations around historic zones? And would a historic zone be considered part of that 25% that's excluded, or is it in addition to?
The historic could be part of the 25% if you went that route. You could also allow the middle housing so far we've been taking a very light touch with our historic overlays, excluding them from most of the geographies that you saw in the earlier item. We do allow middle housing in the UR3 zone in some of our historic overlays, and kind of rely on the design standards to protect the character and the value of the historic homes themselves to avoid tear downs. And there's also review by the historical commission for those sorts of things. But yes, historic overlays could be excluded.
Do we have any accounting of just how many areas in Everett were covered by racially exclusive covenants or deed restrictions?
We do. The University of Washington has a project that has been looking at those deed restrictions throughout the Puget Sound region at least, and it has covered Everett. I'm not going to guess a number. It's not guessing a number, it's trying to remember a number, but somewhere around 5% maybe. But if you search, and I can send a link out, if you search for UW racial covenants, you're sure to find it pretty soon. And they have a map. They have every one of dots on the map for every one of these covenants that exist.
And do we know if any of those racially restrictive covenants also overlap with our historic overlay?
Yeah, that's a good point. So the reason that racial covenants come in is that if you go the route that allows 25% to exclude middle housing, none of those areas can have a racial covenant on them. And so if there's a racial covenant and a historic overlay, I'm not sure which one wins, but I think it's possible that you could not exclude middle housing then. There could be other ways to protect the historic character there. But yeah, that's an important interaction. In Rethink Zoning, I'm not sure how much of it made it to the Planning Commission, but there was a Rethink Zoning 2.0, or it was part of Rethink Zoning until it got peeled off because of the complexity of the conversation. But staff had started to develop essentially middle housing kind of a program in the single family zones, and they had mocked up a UR1 and a UR2 to complement the 3 and 4 that we have now. So that would have collapsed them into two zones, but I think maybe the UR1 would not have allowed middle housing and the UR2 would have. And it was probably a lower scale of middle housing than we're contemplating here.
So if you were to collapse the residential zones into a single zone, would you then collapse the minimum lot area? Or that would be all at the same time, so we would just have one lot
Yeah.
size?
You could, I see the minimum lot area as being much less important. There are very few subdivision opportunities in these areas where there is a lot that is twice as big as the minimum lot area. So fee simple subdivision seems like less of a important path in a middle housing world than condominium. So I guess I see the minimum lot size as being less important without that density limitation that comes with it. But beyond that, I think it's open as to which minimum lot size you chose for subdivision. Maybe you want to shrink it down because that supports fee simple lot splitting.
I was just trying to understand the pros and cons of going to a single one. Certainly simplicity to have a single, resident or, neighborhood residential zone. I think that most closely follows the spirit of the law that we've just got. So it also, I think, is supportive of you trying to have objective criteria in approving. I think it would also help streamline and move things along to make the deadlines that you've been given. So I think I would support that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm looking at those numbers. I mean, they're so similar already. The distinction is so fine. The only difference is the RS zone, 3,000 square feet, which I suppose the difference between 5 and 6 is probably relatively inconsequential. So really, you could easily get it down to 2
Right.
with the RS and then combine the R1, R2, R2A. And if you're going to combine to 2, I mean, it's a half step to down to 1.
Right. R2A is very rare. We have 69 acres of R2A in the city out of 18,000 acres. So it's a very rare zone. It seemed like almost tailor-made for a couple properties. The R2 zone is 2,600 acres. The R1 zone is 4,000 acres, so that's the most common. And then RS zone is 800 acres, so not very much of that either.
And then the lot covers 35 to 40% too. Also seems relatively maybe inconsequential for the most part. Because certainly, I mean, the lots that exist, they're, as you said, they're not gonna. You can't take a 6,000 square foot lot and make 2 5,000. I mean, everything's pretty static no matter what.
Right. I'm thinking.
So I'm just trying to marry this information with the ADU bill and how it requires that you allow parcel segregation to provide ownership opportunities. So when we're talking about minimum lot size, then that would mean that, well, it's probably just better for me to say, how would that interact with the ability to segregate an ADU on one of these parcels and allow an ownership opportunity for that ADU specifically?
I think under the proposed ADU ordinance that was recommended out, you could do the ownership segregation anywhere. You could also build an ADU on any lot without regard to whether it meets the minimum lot size or not. The bill allows that you could prohibit an ADU if a lot was smaller than the minimum lot size, but our current ordinance at least does not take advantage of that.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm gonna try to find the minimum density because how it interacts with the minimum lot size might be important. No. Okay, here we go. So maximum density in the RS zone is 1 unit per 9,000, so that's the same. R1 is 1 unit per 6,000. R2 is 1 unit per 3,750 square feet. So if you were to build a duplex today in the R2 zone, you would need 7,500 square feet. Not sure exactly how that fits into here, but that's the density limitations that are in 1906-110 for attached housing.
Could you just build a smaller duplex
Of lot area.
that'd be the maximum?
The maximum would be 1 unit per 3,750 square feet of lot area.
One
So if-
unit.
So if you have a 5,000 square foot lot in the R2 zone, you cannot build a duplex
Currently.
currently. I'm just trying to
Even
think.
under House Bill 1110?
No, this is under our
Okay.
existing code. I'm trying to think of other
Yeah.
contexts for the minimum lot area. There's also unit lot subdivisions, which have like an alternate path to subdivision and subdivision laws and some pretty complicated things. So we'll keep thinking about that minimum lot area and how it interacts with all of this. And maybe let's keep going through these other standards, and that can inform a little bit about how we want to distinguish between different areas of the city. It is worth noting that the areas zoned RS now are quite different in lot patterns than the areas zoned R2, North Everett versus Mukilteo Boulevard are very different places. The regulations may work well similarly for both of them, especially since most of the lot pattern is already relatively set by subdivisions. But just something to keep in mind that they're very different neighborhoods. Height. Existing, everything that is pale yellow there is 28 feet. Height and setbacks and lot coverage seem very intertwined with the neighborhood character. And the whole point of middle housing is that it fits in well with single-family neighborhoods. You could walk down the street and it would look fairly similar if you had a string of duplexes or something, or quadplexes, as if you had houses, assuming a certain level of care in design. So it's compelling to potentially leave a lot of those bulk regulations as they are now, and you would move from a system where up until last year, we used to count how many people are in a structure, and there was a limit to the number of unrelated adults who could live in a dwelling unit. And it was a state law that required us to eliminate that, but we did that last year in the package of amendments. And so we stopped counting how many people are in a structure. Middle housing kind of says stop counting how many front doors are on a structure, but you can still regulate the bulk on that. So it's compelling to maybe keep some of those bulk regulations relatively static, because you're saying you would be able to build right now a house that's that big, that goes this wide and this tall and this deep. So shouldn't it follow that you can build a duplex that's the exact same size and it just happens to have 2 different doors on it or something? On the other hand, 28 feet limits development opportunities somewhat. Other cities are more commonly in the 30 to 35 foot range. 28 feet, as I heard, was a pretty important one in rethink zoning and pretty important to the neighborhoods. It is roughly 2 floors plus a pitched roof, maybe a half floor above or something like that. Or you could, if you wanted to get 3 full floors, you could dig down a little bit. So that's it, yeah.
So with regard to the 28 feet, can I ask if you know what height would we need to be at in order to, because if we're going to be eliminating parking regulations, on-street parking regulations, that would incentivize people to, as they're building, build those in maybe a ground level. And so how many feet would we need to authorize in order to make that an option for property owners to meet their needs for their parking on their property?
I think that's unanswerable because it depends on the size of the lot. If you mean a garage and 2 floors above it, very hard to do with 28 feet. Probably impossible. I think generally it's 10 feet per residential floor you can maybe squeeze that down to 8. But I don't see many 3-story buildings that come in. Now, you could dig it down a little bit, which was very common. I still am not exactly sure why that has become nearly taboo in the development world. I assume it's a little bit more expensive of a foundation, and then you have to deal with the water and all of that. But the benefit in terms of a trade-off of having not very, very tall buildings, but yet you get your full 3 floors seems very worth it to me, but I don't know, there must be a cost obstacle there. It's pretty substantial. So yeah, three full stories and 35 feet would certainly make more housing possible and would facilitate parking in the structures to the extent that anybody uses their garage for parking, actually. But at the cost of bulk and scale in the neighborhood.
Just my support, I would support going to higher in at least 30, and I would entertain 35.
Others, I see.
I assume that, because you mentioned that many other municipalities have that increased height regulation, and I would assume it's to solve this exact problem, to give property owners more flexibility. Is that true generally, to your knowledge?
Probably. I mean, yeah, it's a very common development type to have the garage on the ground floor, and you kind of need 2 floors worth unless it's a relatively wide and deep house. That does lead also to kind of a looming feeling. Those are pretty tall,
Yeah.
especially when they're close together.
I definitely agree with Commissioner Ballard. I would support that as well. I really see this as very empowering for for individual homeowners and families to not have to wait for the market to meet their needs, but to plan how they are going to meet their needs on the property that they own. So I would support that type of flexibility.
Any other thoughts on that?
I guess I don't know that I have much opinion, but I suppose the counterpoint would be that, I mean, certainly I doubt people are going to be modifying their existing home and adding an extra 4 to 6 feet. I mean, this would only be something would basically apply to either someone that is building something new that doesn't exist or demolishing and building something new. And I would just say in those situations, you probably are necessarily inviting there to be something put on that is going to be inconsistent with the character of the existing neighborhood. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or bad thing, but that to me would seem to me that would be the natural consequence. It's going to be something new or something completely different. It's not just going to be another house that just and I also suppose you need to go up in a certain amount of increment to make it even feasible, because going up from 28 to 30, you can't add a floor. So you're going to have to go probably at least, 38 for it to really make a difference. And at that point, you're talking probably, like I said, significantly different than anything else that's already in these neighborhoods.
Yeah, there's so many different, depends on the topography, as far as sometimes individual feet matter. If you've got some topography and depending on your roof shape and style and all of that. Even 2 feet would make a difference for some developments, but not others. And okay. I'll keep going, and we can definitely circle back to any of these as we get to the end. So setbacks, 20 feet front, 20 feet rear, except, as you may remember, accessory dwelling units are permitted 0 setback on an alley lot. And then 5-foot side setback, except 10 feet if you have a corner lot and your side is on the street. You may remember the low-rise zone was like up to 3 floors, roughly. You may be thinking, what's the difference between that and middle housing? And we're thinking the setbacks is the difference. And in the low-rise zone, you would have maybe 0 setbacks, or at least much smaller setbacks that could allow for a full lot to be covered with something more approximating a small courtyard apartment building. But in the middle housing zone, you would continue the traditional pattern of having space on all four sides of an individual structure.
York, would you say that 20 feet front, back, and 5 on side is a pretty standard, I mean, across the nation, maybe even? Or is there areas that are,
Probably, these types of standards tend to spread from a model code written in the 50s, and then every single city picked it up
and that's kind of like my question, my point is, I mean, is this just orthodoxy, so you put 20, 20, and 5, and that's what you do? Or is there some real reason for that? And I'm just wondering, is there opportunity to maybe reconsider that? Because certainly, when you're talking smaller lots, I mean, if you could go a little wider, that could really change, what you can do with properties, how many people you can put in there. And if there's not a real reason for it, if it's just because it's what people did since the 50s, maybe rethinking that is an option. And I don't know, I don't know if there's anything in the building codes that make that more convenient, but something,
No, there's
just raising the question to think about it.
Yeah, there's very little in terms of constraints in the building code to building closer. Really what it is a front yard and a backyard. And so if you have a 60-foot wide lot and you've got 20 feet in the front and the back, that's a 60, 20, 300 square foot yard. And this perpetuates a requirement to have front and back yards, and then the side yard. I mean, it's a pattern you see all over the place, and it could be bigger or smaller. I want to say that the RS zone maybe used to have a 40-foot setback. Maybe I'm wrong on that. The complicating factor for the front setback, at least, is that is to the property line and the beginning of the right-of-way. The beginning of the right-of-way sometimes is the sidewalk, or sometimes even the curb. Sometimes the beginning of the right-of-way is another 20 feet of grass. And so how this setback, especially the front one, actually plays out on a street is different in different places. What the front setback does, especially if it's held consistent for a long period of time, is you walk down a street and all the buildings are lined up neatly. And that is probably good for a comfortable relationship and scale to your streetscape and to lines of sight, and all that sort of thing.
The other thing about the front setback is that the 20 feet is about the length of a vehicle. And if you have a driveway going up to a garage, which is a common situation, you want to have enough room to park a vehicle outside the garage, and the 20 feet accommodates most vehicles for that anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I have two questions. In the existing, when they refer to alleyways, what about easements? A lot of people near me actually have easements. We don't have alleys or driveway, So is it the same thing?
The setbacks would apply to the parent lot for a unit lot subdivision. And so individual houses could be closer to the access drive that's an easement drive than they could be to the street. And they can be closer to each other, but the whole pod of 8 houses around a cul-de-sac that comes off of an arterial, the pod itself needs to be set back on those numbers from neighboring pods, but within them, that's why you see houses much closer to both, 1 foot away from the access drive or even overhanging it, and then, just a couple feet away from the neighbors.
I think I'm thinking because my neighborhood has a lot of older homes built between the 50s and 60s, so they're all really large lots. And we don't have cul-de-sacs and we don't really face the street. And so I'm trying to think about how this is going to apply to my neighbors. And it kind of makes it seem like we can all just build like 5 duplexes on our lots because they're so large. So my other question was, and maybe I just don't understand, when we talk about 20 feet in front, 20 feet in rear, is there options that you would have that flexible? Like you can, long as it totals something between the front and the back, like is that ever done?
I don't know when setbacks are not modifiable in our code. many things are modifiable. The maximum height is not, and the setbacks are not. That tells me that one of two things. Either it was one of the most important numbers in the entire development code, or the planning staff were just being bombarded with requests constantly that they had a difficult time saying you can, but you cannot. And so they said, forget it, no more modification requests. But no, it is 20 feet. I mean, there are some scenarios. There's someone who it's a right-of-way that was gonna be kind of Rucker a long, long time ago, or was gonna be the Highway 99 corridor, but now it's just a little street. So it's like a little street with no sidewalks, but like a 60-foot right-of-way, and no one would know that your property line ends all the way over here. Wants to build an accessory dwelling unit on it, seems absolutely reasonable with the scale, with everything. There's tons of room. There's nothing that we can do to allow it. And actually, at some point, we'd like to seek a code amendment to allow some flexibility in that regards. But right now, it is absolutely flat, except the unit lot subdivisions where you have a parent lot and then smaller units within them.
So I could see that applying to my neighborhood.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All of this, I think it was mentioned in a previous meeting, all of this is subject to covenants, what's the other C, conditions and restrictions, CC&Rs, and easements included that. This does not remove the need to comply with those covenants, which are, I think, somewhat widespread in the city. So there are plenty of neighborhoods where you cannot, Hannahbrook was one that I looked at that's 100 units or something like that, and no subdivision, no accessory dwelling units, one single house per lot, and 3 off-street parking spaces per lot, and then other things on fences and all that sort of thing. Doesn't matter what we do, per the private covenants, you will never build middle housing in that development.
Those aren't superseded by House Bill 1110?
No. New ones are prohibited, so if you do a new subdivision, you cannot record a new covenant that prohibits additional housing in the future, but existing ones are private contracts and continue to be enforceable. We don't enforce them as a city, which can lead to some discomfort with your neighbors when you get through the permit process and then your neighbor sues you for violating the covenant. So do take a look at your own covenants and restrictions before applying for permits.
Does the city have to factor that in when we're talking about the 25% exclusion, for example? Can we include those?
I guess you could include them or not, and it wouldn't matter.
I guess it doesn't, okay.
We should keep an eye on that for our capacity numbers, though. There's, however many thousands, 7,000 acres of single-family zoning. Of that 7,000 acres, some number of that is off the table for middle housing, and we shouldn't claim capacity for all of that. We don't know about all of them, and we're not going to read every single one, so we're going to have some reasonable assumption of percentage of land.
So we don't know what percentage of the land we're talking about that would be covered by these particular covenants. We don't have like a ballpark. It's interesting that you mentioned that that's just kind of widely seen standard since the 50s. And I've just been trying to delve into figuring out where some of these things come from. And a lot of standard regulatory things of this nature popped up in the 50s. And a lot of that was driven by ways to create exclusionary zoning that achieved the same result that was outlawed when Jim Crow zoning was outlawed. And so I guess when I hear, oh, that's just kind of how it's been since the 50s, I just kind of think, well, is that, we don't know what the reason was necessarily today, but is that what it needs to be? And do we have a way of assessing what it actually does need to be?
I think with setbacks, other than the need sometimes for space for utilities and all that, a lot of it is just the feel of a neighborhood. I think we're taking important steps to allow more people and more housing choices and for people to have access to different neighborhoods and amenities than they've had before, through exclusionary zoning and all of that. But something like a setback and a height limit is also an important part of the look and a feel of the street and the character. Washington DC is a very beautiful city, and they have their setback is the width of the road times the height is related to the width of the road, and all those sorts of things. You don't know why this feels like a pleasant street to stroll down, but sometimes those are the reasons for it. And we're trying to keep in mind that to some extent this is, no, not to some extent, this is pretty revolutionary in planning. And so we're trying to keep an eye to making sure that we are adding that housing opportunity and choice in the way that is the most gentle to the neighborhoods that are important for the people who live there now and the people who will live there in the future.
I'm not sure that there's any real science behind any of this, but I think that the 10-foot minimum separation between houses, that's the genesis of the 5-foot setback, is, I think, has been considered as minimum fire separation between buildings. Again, I'm not sure how much science is behind that, but I think that's
I
been kind of
heard
the-
that as well for the side setbacks. I
The
was more
sides,
thinking of the
yeah.
front and the rear setbacks. But yeah, because you don't want to get into a situation where you literally have a shared wall or where property owners cannot do maintenance without going onto their neighbor's property.
Right.
So absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that, Commissioner Zelinski.
Yeah, and I guess I'd just bring it up. I mean, we are talking some revolutionary changes. How do you have a revolution by, trying to hang on to as much as you can from the past? I mean, sometimes it's throwing some things out that, and being all in. Again, I don't necessarily know, but something to think about.
Lot coverage, so I see the height, setbacks, and the lot coverage as kind of the big three in terms of the bulk on a property. Those two on the bottom are just an example, so you can visualize what two different lot coverages are. Common 6,000 foot lot, I think it's the most common lot size in the city, and 50 by 120 is a pretty common one, especially in North Everett, I believe. These were both modeled off existing sites, I believe. And note that lot coverage is only buildings, not impervious surface, not paved area. Even with a 35% lot coverage, you can still, I think, pave most of your lot. We have a 5% bonus for accessory dwelling units in our existing code above that. And it seemed to us reasonable to offer kind of a bonus. There's nothing that says you can be less restrictive for middle housing than for detached housing. I think there's good rationale to have incentives to focus on more housing units rather than larger houses. And so it seems reasonable to offer a 5 or 10% bonus on lot coverage, or that's just picking numbers for middle housing. But if you're just going to build a house, that you would stick to that original one, or the lot coverages could change.
And just to clarify, the 5% bonus for ADUs, that stacks, right?
No, well, with the code amendment, right now you can only have one anyways, but with the code as we drafted it and recommended to the council, it is written in such a way that it's 5% for both, which is pretty constraining. Can be constraining on a smaller lot, but one of the ADUs could be one level of the house, and that doesn't take any building area.
Well, I mean, since we're thinking about it, I mean, where does the 35 to 40% coverage number come from? Do we know? Is I mean, just industry standard?
I don't know. I mean, those, maybe from the 50s, but this is something that probably, shifted back and forth over time, would be my guess. It's important to have private open space and room for yards. It's not always used for yards. Sometimes it's just, it is big driveways and things like that. Parking, right now, we require, in chapter 34, 2 per unit, or if you're on one of those access drives that is kind of a panhandle lot or a little private cul-de-sac off of the main road, then you need 3. At 5+ units, which is the high end of middle housing but overlaps a little bit, then you get into the multifamily parking standards, which are lower and depend on the size of the bedroom. With the middle housing bill, the 3 has to go away because the limit is 2 no matter what per dwelling unit. But otherwise, the other ones are legal under the bill, except if you're close to transit or if you have a smaller than 6,000 square foot lot, so we would have to incorporate that, and the limit would be 1 or 0. But parking, as we've discussed and will continue to discuss for time immemorial to the future, is both highly desired by the community to preserve public right-of-way parking, on-street parking, and also the #1 barrier to development, and also the #1 consumer of space and height. That's so we need cars, we need a place to put them. They also don't look great. People love them, people don't love them. So I don't know, we have in our housing action plan to do a whole parking study that would look from top to bottom of the scale, and we still plan to do that at some point in the future. We could stay with a relatively steady, roughly 2 per unit for this. That 4-plex then is gonna have 8 parking spots required, whether they want them or not. I think to me, 1 per unit seems like a pretty reasonable place. Everybody needs at least 1, but if you've got multiple cars, then you can use the street parking for that overflow. And yeah.
I don't know if any of you happened to watch recent council meetings. Councilmember Vogely actually framed it in a way that I found interesting. And she said, if you think about public street parking as public property and vehicles as personal property, then you start to think about how much free space the public is giving to individual personal property owners that may or may not benefit the community as a whole. So I just thought that was a interesting reframing of the parking issue, because I had not really specifically thought of it in those terms. More than 1 vehicle per unit has always seemed excessive to me.
One thing to remember, and the city probably has some good experience with this to the extent that there are new subdivisions going in, and I don't know what the subdivision activity is in the city. It might be pretty minimal at this point. But both land cost and stormwater regulations are driving developers to narrower streets, which may be that in the future there won't be the kind of street parking that we've grown accustomed to based on development that's occurred already. Again, it may not be a factor for the city of Everett, but to the extent that it might be, that's something to consider. Yeah.
For instance, in more places that were platted in the 80s, 90s, and beyond, most of the streets do not have parking. I think it was the skate deck development. We were looking at the parking supply, and it was like a mile to the nearest street parking, because there's none on the arterials, and all of the side streets are no parking as well. I don't know how that can work. How you're setting up to have to either steal parking from the grocery store down the street or park illegally in a fire lane if you are ever in your life going to have 4 friends over at the same time. So it seems like the street parking is an important overflow, and it enables us not to, it's something like 3 or 4 parking spaces per human in the United States or something, because you need one at home, you need one at work, you need one at the shopping center, and you need one extra one for holiday season shopping that just sits empty the rest of the year. That could be shrunk significantly with a major benefit to cost and stormwater and all those sorts of things, because, yeah, the streets and the width, but also that off-street parking space is the same amount of impervious surface. So, yeah, it's a tough one. That I think of it as almost the opposite, that we should use the public right-of-way to reduce the reliance on private property for the cars, but it is absolutely giving away public property for private use and storage of private property. But it seems to offer the most flexibility for an individual development, and that things kind of shake out, and that nobody is prohibited from building parking to their heart's content. This is only a government regulation forcing you to build more parking than you otherwise would have wanted to build.
Who's feeling brave? Who wants to talk about parking? Commissioner Sullivan, you're up.
Just one thing that came to mind, because it looks like my neighborhood is going to receive a lot of low-rise, and then also, obviously, the neighborhood residential. So we're going to have a lot of bigger buildings. Young people tend to have a lot of roommates, so you look at 3 people sharing a 3-bedroom, they're going to have 3 cars, they're going to have 1 person come over, that's 4 parking spots, per occasion. So I don't know the right answer, but just remembering that the people who live in these houses are not always the same. They don't always just have, a family car.
Right. Right. And we're building out our transit system, and it's, you'd like to not have to have a car. There are plenty of households in the city who do not own cars.
And I just want to circle this back to the height discussion, because I think that, I'm sorry about that. I think that has a lot of implications in terms of individuals' ability to choose how they're going to handle this on their own property, especially if they're renting out, because that can have a significant impact on what you can rent for if you offer parking versus you don't offer parking, or just meeting your own needs on your own property.
Big surprise, so I'm consistent. I would go down in parking. I would 1 per unit and support that. Again, I think if you continue to provide parking, people are going to take advantage of it, and to me, it's just subsidized parking. So I would recommend having it lower. It's a minimum. It doesn't mean they have to, or it doesn't limit them from doing more parking if they want to. But it gives us the option, if you want to tailor your building and your property to people that ride buses and bicycles and things like that, and try to take alternative, and then they have that ability, and it doesn't have to increase their rent for a spot that they don't use.
I would go so far as to say I don't necessarily see much of a point for parking minimums. As I mentioned during the Rethink Housing Committee, I think that renters are smart enough people to recognize when a property isn't going to have sufficient parking for them and choose not to rent at that property. But there's a growing amount of young people in this city that do not want cars, do not want that financial burden, and are willing to bike, walk, or take transit around. And I just think that it feels paternalistic to assume that every unit needs parking.
Okay. I'll throw out that this is a simple way to show it. We also have reductions, and there may be again, it's a very diverse city in terms of land forms and lot patterns and everything. You can reduce that 2 per unit if you're within a quarter mile of transit. Now that's already gonna have to go down to 0 per the state law, but there are other ways to kind of differentiate. Or would it be subjective to put it on the planners? We don't want that responsibility, but this idea that there is no street parking, what else are you gonna do? But if there is street parking, then you could, so. Okay, and a reminder again, with all of this, we are crafting a deliverable to the Department of Commerce that is a reasonable starting point for the conversation about middle housing that would go into the alternative 3 and be studied in the environmental impact statement. And then we will actually have to make a decision on all of these in the next year and a half. Critical areas environment, this will involve more development and more building and more scale and more people in areas that have less of it now. And you could easily imagine some impacts to our environmental functions in critical areas. The critical area chapter remains in effect, and so there's a 50-foot buffer around a type NS stream right now that is required, and then some details around that. That would still be in effect fully for middle housing. So you can't build a house in the buffer, you can't build a duplex in the buffer, and nothing about this changes that. We will be reviewing our critical area regulations with respect to any development. I think that's due after the periodic update, so we'll pick up a little bit of that as part of this process and more of that right after, to look at those buffers and how they are functioning. Stormwater is a little bit different than critical areas because the functions of the wetlands and the streams and all of that should be fully protected by the critical areas ordinance. Stormwater gets into somewhat of a utility and somewhat of a kind of nuisance flooding and ponding issues and those sorts of things. We have a robust stormwater utility program that reviews all development that creates over some number of square feet of impervious surface, and you'd have to comply with the latest pollution control, flow control, and all of those requirements. In many cases, new development, we're working with our stormwater team on an update to the stormwater comprehensive plan, and they showed the whole city and the era of development, and about the best thing you could do for stormwater was to redevelop something. So you would think that single family going to some more intense type of development would be a net negative for the water cycle. But most of the development in the city predated strict stormwater regulations, and so the stormwater just flows right into the wetland or right into the city's storm drains or something like that. Redevelopment would need to comply with all of the latest regulations. So over time, the more development that we have, as I understood it from that process, the better that our water quality gets. We still should think about overall neighborhood level, and we'll look at this in the environmental impact statement, overall neighborhood level impervious surfaces and how that kind of the interaction of the stormwater regulations and the critical areas and all of that. That map on the lower left shows land cover in, I think that's all single family zoning right now. And you can see that just because it's single family and has those setbacks does not necessarily mean that there's a lot of tree cover and everything. But still, we have ambitious goals around tree cover, and we're trying to increase that canopy. And the higher the lot coverage goes, the bigger the driveways are, the more parking and all those sorts of things, the less room there is for infiltration and low impact development and trees and all of that. So there's no particular standard here, but just something to keep in mind as we're thinking through all the rest of them. The map on the right are the watersheds of the city, and everything in white in the middle is the combined storm system. So that is where rainwater goes into the sewer system and is treated in our wastewater treatment plant before being discharged into the Snohomish River. Everything else, when you flush, it goes in the sewer. When rain falls on your roof or your yard or your street, it goes into the wetland and the creeks. treated if it's newer development, untreated if it's not. We will be covering stormwater, yeah.
So on the combined system, is there a plan or a capital improvement that's slowly reducing that?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so.
I didn't realize it was still that big. I thought they had done more work to undo that.
It's good in one sense because you want to be treating all of the oil and tire dust that goes into the storm drains that otherwise, and so that's a good thing. It means there's no functioning streams or wetlands or hydrology of any sort in the white area, which is not as good, I guess. We will definitely have our stormwater folks have a whole session with you on this topic for the whole comprehensive plan. Design, we're almost done here, I think. Design chapter 19.08 has a list of design standards that apply only to attached housing in single-family zones. So this is that example of things that will need to either make applicable to detached housing as well as attached housing or drop it. And those include site design. So for example, in 1908-040, design standards for townhouses and duplexes in RS1, 2, and R2A zones. Design sites to have both an external orientation to the streetscape and an internal orientation to the residential environment with unifying open space and pedestrian pathways. That might be too subjective. No more than one street access point for every 2 units is allowed unless on a corner lot. Facades for each dwelling unit must include at least 2 of the following architectural elements: horizontal modulation, bay, bow, or garden windows, building ornamentation such as a frieze or other architectural elements the planning director determines accomplishes the intent. Vertical modulation and setback variation between dwelling units with no more than 2 adjacent dwelling units having the same setback. You can see in the picture an example of the nice architectural features that provides. They all seem like good planning practices. Right now, you do not have to build them for a house. And there's one that I walked by and it's just flat walls and doesn't meet any of these. So yeah, that's our charge, is to either, and I think we were kind of leaning towards, if they're all good design elements, then maybe keep them and apply them to detached houses as well, rather than ditching the whole thing. That's kind of where we were leading.
So so you mentioned you walk past some properties that don't meet this. So yeah, there are some properties that don't meet that. And so when people start talking about design, that's when the neighborhood character discussions start coming in. Are those properties, are we receiving complaints? Were those properties, when they were built, were neighborhoods complaining about them being built? Do we have any information about how the neighborhood reacted to those existing properties that don't meet these?
I don't. Folks who have been around the city longer than me or have a better ear to the ground probably do. I mean, I hear comments in public forums and all that, but most of the grumbling usually happens away from our ears, I think.
Okay. And so what was the rationale behind not requiring these for residences and keeping these? What was the rationale? Why isn't it the same currently, I guess? So what was the rationale for not having it the same previously?
I have a theory, not far from a guess, which is that a single-family home is a castle and it shall not be dictated in any way by government. But when you start putting 2 together, now we are going to be all over that with rules. That is my guess.
Okay.
I guess my theory would be it's more reasoning because of exclusionary measures, but I guess my concern would be, though, separately from that, is that if we have too many design restrictions on the missing middle section, it will force people then to go to the ADU to get out of it. So I would balance that a little bit. If you make it really hard to do missing middle, you're gonna get a bunch of people that are gonna try to force it into ADUs, and you might not get as good as you think, or it might actually be worse.
Okay, so if you want to look more in detail at this, look at the top couple of subsections in 1908, and you can read through them. These are summaries here. Many of them are subjective and are going to have to go no matter what. Yeah. The rest of them will have to decide to keep them and expand them or drop them. I think this is the last one, yes. Landscaping, for similar to the other ones, for if you're building a detached house or duplex, landscaping requirement is that everything that's not covered by parking and buildings should be grass. And the main reason for that is just erosion control, grass or other soil living ground cover. The idea is that if it's dirt, things are running off, and that's not good. So that was like the very least regulation possible. Attached housing, if you build it, you must have street trees, and for land divisions at least, you need to have street frontages with shrubs and trees, the kind of stuff that you see pretty frequently with new development. But if you're building one house on this lot, then everything can be grass. You don't have to build a street tree. If you're building a duplex, now you need street trees. And I'm not sure about the type 3 5-foot, if that's only for land divisions versus a duplex on a single lot, but same kind of a deal. Seems like if we're looking for more tree canopy, street trees is a great way to do it without stymieing development, and everybody loves them. Seems reasonable to expand that rather than delete it. And that's it. So we got a couple of thoughts from you on how to fill in some of those proposed. We have some thoughts too. All of this is just starting the conversation, not ending it. I think we're gonna have to turn in our deliverable before our next meeting 2 weeks from today, but we'd like to continue this conversation. If you'd like to continue this, we have a whole pile of other topics to get to over the next year and a half, but this is a pretty important one. Is there anything that you can think of in terms of advice on how to package this and how to come back? We've got some good questions that we'll do some research on. Any other ways to look at this? We can come back and go through these same ones now that we've had a couple of weeks to chew on it, and maybe compare it to answer some of those questions. We can call this good for now and turn to other topics and come back to middle housing a little bit later in the year, with an eye more towards what we're going to do rather than how to begin the conversation. Do you have any other thoughts on that, Becky?
I think a regular conversation about middle housing in some way is probably best, because it is something very fairly new to the community about what the state law is going to require. And when this came up during rethink, it was a very difficult process, and it ended up getting pulled back out of that process. And so I'm thinking just maybe not waiting till much later, but continue the conversation so it's in front of the community as well, is my only thought.
Commissioner Ballard?
There's a milestone for the Commerce Department on the 30 June, right? So, I mean, I know they gave the briefing and I watched it, but I'm just thinking that would probably give us the strongest justification on some of these rules that we've seen. It might be helpful for us to understand as well as the public. So maybe after that, if you're looking at a timing like when to come back, maybe once we've had a chance to absorb that, and that comes out.
And you're referring to the kind of guidance documents and model reports and things, yeah, which is coming right after the grant work program. That would have been very useful, but everybody's trying their best.
Commissioner Zelinski.
One suggestion I would have is that one perspective that we've seen here tonight, and it's a very legitimate one, is how can we best accommodate and encourage middle housing in single-family neighborhoods? But I think for the interest of balance and keeping in mind neighborhood wishes, even if they're not showing up for our outreach sessions, is the idea of neighborhood character impact, and trying to think of each of these things in terms of neighborhood character impact. I think we still have policies in the comp plan that talk about preserving neighborhood character. So that's kind of the other side of the balance, if you will. We need the middle housing, we need to find ways to get it, but we want to do it without adversely impacting neighborhood characters. So, for instance, just in terms of my own thinking, my initial instinct on building height was, yeah, we're coming into a middle housing world, so let's just go up with the building height. But then I began to think about, well, what this could produce is existing homes that are 28 feet and less, and newer multifamily that are going to be at the 35 or whatever the new height is. And what does that do to neighborhood impact? Is that an acceptable impact or not? I mean, I think you can argue it both ways. So I think trying to consider that as well as how can we better accommodate this missing middle housing to get the balance, to maintain the balance.
To your point, Commissioner Zelinski, the definition of middle housing in the bill itself is compatible in scale, form, and character with single-family neighborhoods.
I guess to that point, I mean, kind of maybe the question is it really compatible? Are you trying to take something that isn't compatible and package it as though it's going to be, but they're never going to be? I don't know. That's the challenge, I guess. And I suppose at one level, you can keep trying, but if it's never going to work, maybe you just need to let it go and say, this is just the new world. And again, that's the balance too. I don't know. It's tough.
It is very tough. I think that change, especially when you're dealing with what is most people's primary asset, which is their home. And so it's not just a question, like developers, they look at things in terms of numbers, but people look at things in terms of, this is where I raise my kids. These are emotional questions as much as they are, questions where you can make a business case. So in that regard, sometimes any change becomes unacceptable or difficult or unpalatable in some manner because it's different and it's unfamiliar, and there's a lot of very rational fear around the impact on what is your primary big ticket asset, which is your home. So that is not an irrational response from the community, and I think we need to acknowledge that and be aware of it, which is why I really agree with you, Becky, that we need to continue to have this conversation. We need to make sure that all of these thoughts that are being put forward by these wonderful representatives of the community are being heard, and that folks can come in and also offer their perspectives. We do have to find a way forward. We have to find a way to get to yes with these units that we need to accommodate our population. But I think we need to be thoughtful in the process.
I guess I just had one other thought, hasn't come up, is I know sometimes when I'm conceptualizing this too, I start thinking, okay, what's the impact in the neighborhood? This is how these changes. But given that, at least in our city, the number of open or unoccupied spaces is very low. So any change is going to be I think relatively slow and incremental. So this isn't going to be like opening a floodgate and all of a sudden every neighborhood in the city is going to be changing. If this does happen, I think keeping the perspective right, I do think it would be relatively, it's going to be one. It's going to be a very slow process. So I guess just keeping that perspective as well.
Absolutely agree. And also the perspective of what is the cost of not doing these things. And with regard to the design standards, that's a real difficult one for me because I'm always hesitant to add a regulatory element to something that where it wasn't there, it didn't seem to be an issue. There wasn't an outcry in the community, and yet now we're thinking of adding this list of regulatory elements where there wasn't previously one. And I understand that the thought is, well, we need to control for this new element, but again, that goes back to fear around change and newness versus really drilling down and deciding what is necessary in terms of our regulations. And yeah, thank you, commissioners, for all of your really thoughtful, the information you present. I appreciate it. I think we have one last opportunity for public comment.
Here. So
Please state your name and your
OJ Marston.
Okay, thank you.
So you guys talked about, which you brought it up and it made me think about the CC&Rs in the neighborhoods and how would that impact? And of course, we don't know how many CC&Rs will affect it. Did I understand that right? You're gonna just let people apply and then if their neighbor sues them later after it's been approved by the city, then that's how it's gonna roll out? So you guys did your job and kind of, is that, or is there gonna be something to where we go, hey, maybe we should look, that's a requirement that you should probably look into from the title company and get, to see if there's anything. And I just say that because I'm a real estate agent, so I think of the thought of, oh my gosh, this could become an absolute nightmare down the road. But I also know from doing this 30 years that there's active and inactive CC&Rs and developments all around here. And so, like my old house off the boulevard, off of Ocean, I'm kind of a geek, so I wanted to know about the old stuff. And it was, when you talked about why did this stuff happen, it was for views. It was strictly, the whole neighborhood was about views. But yet, could you see anybody paying dues or being part of the organization? It was built back in '58. No, most people don't know what they don't know until a neighbor builds a 35-foot something and now they're pissed. And do you see what I'm saying? I'm like, and I mean, I'm all for development, don't get me wrong. I understand we need it, but I'm like, wow, how do we navigate that? And then who determines if that is, CC&R is no longer active because it hasn't been acted upon with all the other things that the neighbors have been doing? It's just something to think about. I think it's a really thing to ponder. I don't have an answer for it, but it just made me go, oh, I could see me being cautious with people going, because I feel like right now there's a lot of multi-generational housing going on. And there's people who are wanting to build places for their relatives on their property. And I think it should be cohesive. I think that's a beautiful thing for the development of our neighborhoods, and we should be, I have clients who they can't build a shop unless it matches their house. They can't build the Big Ten place that's ugly, you know what I mean? So there's a happy medium somewhere, I do believe, but I think that's something that we should be, I don't know how to fix it, but be aware of it. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Any additional comments here in person? Any online, Kathy?
No virtual guest tonight.
Okay, thank you. Well, that takes us to the end of our agenda. So with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.